Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be reviewing various student questions from Reddit. So I have pulled up here Reddit, which is a popular online community and forum, as many of you know. There is an applying to college subreddit here. This is a forum with over 1 million members, 1.1 million members to be exact. Lots of angsty teenagers with college questions, and so I thought this would be a fun and entertaining and hopefully also informative episode as I go through basically answering some of these various questions that a lot of students have at different points in the process. Many of them are going to be rising seniors who are in the application process right now, and then they're going to be students who are in younger grades, and so they have posted various questions in this forum, and I'm going to go through and answer 5 of them. So let's get started. Number 1, choosing which letters of recs to send is the title. So the student writes, "Hi, I'm applying this year and need some advice. I'm applying as a material science/material science engineering major to colleges with that option. To colleges without, I'm applying as chemistry. From teachers, I'm getting a letter of recommendation for AP Calc and IB Global Politics. My worry lies with the additional letters of recommendation. I have 2 options, one for my debate coach and one for my research advisor. My concern is I don't have any science-related recommendations other than my research advisor, but I've only met him 6 months ago when I started my project. I work hard, but I feel like my advisor doesn't really know me. All the known. I think he means all I know. All he knows is I am passionate and get my work done before the deadlines. My debate coach has known me since 8th grade and knows me very well, but I've not been in a debate class, just club, so I can't use him for my teacher letter of recommendations, advice on which I should use." So this student, we first of all have very limited insight into the student's overall candidacy and application and profile. And as I've mentioned on earlier episodes, this is very, 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 very common. Nearly every single student, certainly in this forum, and very, very many parents are always asking tactical questions versus kind of larger strategic questions, or really understanding that a lot of the answers to these questions rely on a lot of other contingencies. And so this tends to drive a lot of people quite insane when they'll ask a question and then I ask them another 8 questions in return. And the reason for that is the answer to the downstream tactical questions, such as this one, depends a lot on what you're trying to do in the macro. So it's going to depend, answers to recommendation questions are going to depend on what you're positioning for. The big question is that the correct thing to be positioning for based on your candidacy? So we're going to obviously have to take some of these students at their word. This student says that he's applying for material science and material science engineering. Or if the college doesn't have that as a major, he's going to be applying for chemistry as a backup. So that is something important to note. It will depend on the college as to what majors you can apply for, if there's even an engineering school in the first place, because there might not be. So that really depends college by college. And so the major selection and the academic option will change as you move from each college, to the next one. So we do have to sort of take the student at their word here because we can't get more information to even know, okay, are they a competitive material science engineering student? What did their course rigor look like? What did their grades look like? What did their breakdown and their STEM scores look like? What did their activities look like, et cetera, et cetera. But we're going to take the student at their word because we can't question the overall strategy and all the other contingencies because we don't have enough information. That would be where I would typically start, and where our team would typically start is evaluating the overall positioning strategy and making sure that that's correct before you then go downstream and start worrying about tactical questions such as letters of recommendation and supplementary recs and all of these downstream questions. But again, since we don't have access, we're going to take the student for their word. So the student is first off concerned because he's applying primarily for science fields, but he does not have a teacher letter of recommendation that is from a science teacher. Now, the general rule of thumb for letters of recommendation, teacher letters of recommendation, generally you want to get a letter from a STEM teacher, either math or science, and then a letter from typically humanities or a social science teacher, such as English or social studies. So the student is following the general rule of thumb on that front. It is possible to break those conventions. For instance, if it's not possible for you to get two very good letters, two very compelling letters, and have those two teachers be in different fields, then there are what I would refer to as override principles, basically exceptions to the typical rules. You would not want to, and this is something that a lot of students and families, I think, get wrong. They're afraid to break certain rules or conventions, and in being afraid to break certain rules or conventions, such as having a STEM and humanities teacher write your letters of recommendation, they might pick a STEM and a humanities teacher, but say their humanities teacher is not going to write them a compelling letter of recommendation, and they did a good job in following the conventions, but in the process now have a worse and less compelling teacher letter of recommendation. So there are conventions and rules of thumb, and then there are times when the conventions need to be broken, because following the conventions will put you in worse position than breaking the conventions. And this is very hard for many students and families, because they feel like if they're going to break a rule, or if the college admissions website says you need to do this, they're worried that it's going to hurt them if they don't follow the rules. But in following the rules, they end up doing something even worse for their candidacy. So the student he is following the conventions here. He does have an AP Calc. He does have a global politics, so he has one STEM. He has one sort of social sciences or humanities. He's worried about not having a direct science letter, but that's not going to be a huge issue or something that you'd be worried about. He's maybe thinking like he needs an AP chemistry recommendation or an AP physics, and that would potentially be a bit more ideal. But if the student were down to AP Calc or AP Physics, and the AP Calc teacher is going to write a better letter, maybe the AP Physics, you could argue, might be a little bit more relevant. It's the science. He has science positioning, but you still need to really significantly weight the quality of the letter and how specific the anecdotes that will be going into the teacher letter of recommendation, which we'll talk about separately. So if these are basically of the same, pretty much comparable quality, AP Calc and say, a science letter of recommendation, then you might say, okay, tie sort of goes to, the more relevant teacher and the more relevant subject. But if there's any even reasonable disparity in the quality between a science letter and the math letter, I would just say to go with the math letter. If that's going to be the better one by even a moderate amount, the overall quality is going to weigh quite heavily versus the subject relevance. And this is still a pretty relevant class in being AP Calculus to a STEM major. So that is sort of the origin of a lot of the concern. And I would say that it's not a major concern, though it's good that the student's sort of thinking through the nuances a little bit of the science positioning, and then having, a math teacher write it instead of a science teacher. What else can we say about this? What I would say is even probably more important, and the student is likely not aware of, is how significant it is for the student to not merely select these teachers and worry just about the selection, but to ensure the quality of the letters. And this is something that many, many students do not do. Many parents are unaware of. You need to do a very good job in furnishing very specific anecdotes of your contributions in the class, times when you went to office hours, you went above and beyond on a project, how you fostered maybe a collaborative atmosphere when you helped a student. You need to provide a sort of brag sheet or a cover letter. If your teacher does not provide you a questionnaire, many teachers will provide questionnaires to help them with writing the letters of recommendation. But if they do not, and they say, don't worry about it, you don't need to give me any, I don't have a questionnaire for writing these letters. Do not trust that. Make sure you draft up basically your highlight reel from the class. You need to assume that the teacher has many letters of recommendation to write. You need to assume that they're going to be writing it last minute, right before your deadlines, because that is very, very, very often the case. And you need to assume the worst case situation, which is this teacher is writing 50 letters of recommendation and they're doing it 2 weeks before the application deadlines, and they're going to rush your letter of recommendation. You want to make sure they literally have a cheat sheet, so to speak, right at their elbow that they can borrow the content almost verbatim from. And so that's where the student needs to take a very proactive role, and really furnish all those anecdotes. You cannot rely on somebody's memory unless they know you so extremely well and just think that you are, just exceptional in every way, and you have such an amazing relationship and you've known them for multiple years. Maybe you could get by. Even so, assume that that person still has forgotten certain things, or you might want to bend the letter in certain directions to speak about certain pieces of content that you know are not going to be spoken about elsewhere. So you really want to be very proactive. A lot of students do not have that very proactive mindset. They just think that it's all about the selection of the teachers. The student is very focused on the selection of the teachers and worrying a lot about that nuance. And this is very, very common among students and families. They're worried about some nuance that doesn't actually matter a lot. Like it's a very small difference between the student choosing an AP calculus teacher and going with a math recommender versus going with an AP science teacher, for example, because that's their positioning. Very, very, very small delta. But in the meantime, this student doesn't seem to be aware at all as far as furnishing material so that these letters are as exceptional as they really need to be if the student's applying to top colleges, because there's a very strong positivity bias, right? If you're applying to top schools and highly selective institutions, all of these students are straight A students. They have amazing test scores, as we've spoken about on the podcast. And so their letters of recommendation are going to be overwhelmingly biased towards being positive. You need to be the student who has really exceptional, specific anecdotes of going above and beyond. It needs to speak to your intellectual curiosity, your intellectual vitality, and that's what colleges are looking for. They're not looking just for the academic kid who gets good grades. They're looking for kids who have intellectual curiosity, intellectual vitality, exceptional personal traits, and they need to see the specifics, because a teacher mentioning that in general and just saying, oh, Bobby is extremely collaborative, or Bobby helps his peers, or Bobby, is very smart, that's not going to get the job done, right? Versus Bobby went to the library and took out an extra 8 books on this history project. We had a student who was positioning for aerospace engineering, and he spoke about how he took history and he was doing extra research on these Spitfire planes in during the World Wars, and he was really creating these very interesting niche angles of intersecting history and this history research paper with his aerospace engineering interest going above and beyond. And his history teacher mentioned that in his letter. Would his history teacher have mentioned that in his letter if we had not put that in the students' recommendation forms? Probably not, in all likelihood, and certainly would not have mentioned it with the same level of detail and specificity and impressiveness, but that was furnished to the teacher, and the teacher is more than happy to feel good about themselves in writing the student an excellent letter. It makes the teacher's job a lot easier, as long as you are not conveying anything that is false. So, again, this is something where the student is worrying about like a very tiny detail and is focusing mostly on the selection, but needs to be actually really thinking a lot more about the quality and the composition of the letters, which the student can control way more than maybe they perceive. And maybe they're thinking that they're just, gonna choose the teacher, then on autopilot, the teacher's going to write them an exceptional letter because they remember every single last thing that the student did. And that's just that's not even the reality. that is this question. The student is also asking about supplementary, what would be referred to as supplementary recommenders. So those are non-teacher letter writers typically, such as a club advisor, a research advisor. And so the student's mentioning their debate coach. And again, there's a bit of a trade-off here. The debate coach has known the students since 8th grade, knows them extremely well. So very long-running, seemingly high-quality relationship. So the quality overall is a lot better than this other supplementary recommender, who is a science-related recommender and is a science research advisor for the student. So the student, again, is thinking very much about the relevance to the positioning, their major positioning, which is it's very good and very positive. The student is thinking that way. They are thinking correctly in terms of building a very relevant, consolidated profile where everything sort of lines up versus the very well-rounded, scattered student that we've mentioned, who, does a sport and they're applying for this major, but then they have no activities that speak to that major, or that they've begun pursuing it and they want to do pre-med, but their humanity classes are actually stronger and it's just a mess. The student does seem to, at some fundamental level, understand at least the 101 version of putting together basically more or less a job application for this major at this college, and making sure that they have they're thinking in terms of relevance, what teacher recs are going to be relevant, the classes, etc. Now, it is interesting that one of this student's main activities that they're thinking about is debate. One might speculate as to what the relevance or the connection is between debate and material science. But the student does at least seem like they are doing some science research, so hopefully that's on the topic that is relevant to their positioning in the major. Now, back to the question of the supplementary recommenders. Most colleges will, certainly the top and highly selective schools will often require 2 teacher recommendations. In some cases, it could be 1, but you can submit 2 teachers. It really depends on the college. A lot of larger schools, such as the UCs, they don't allow any teacher recommendations. Generally, the larger the school, and if it's a public school, they tend to be stingier on the letters of recommendation, because those very large public institutions tend to prioritize metrics a little bit more than the soft factors. It's quite impractical if you are UCLA and you have 150,000 applicants to be reviewing 300,000 plus teacher recommendations. That's very unwieldy. So it does depend on the institution as to what the recommendation policies are. If you're curious, you can go to the admissions website, but even easier than that, in the common application, if you look up the school on the homepage for the school in the common application, it will tell you the policies regarding teacher recs, and then also what they refer to as other recommenders, which might be something like supplementary recommendations. In terms of supplementary recommendations, they're definitely going to come and play more for top colleges that review more information, because there are more minute distinctions between candidates at the top schools, as we've discussed. However, even at some of the top schools, the committees or the admissions officers are not necessarily required to review a supplementary recommendation if it is submitted. It is definitely a more marginal application component. You don't want to really load up your application file with information unless it's going to add something really unique and extremely compelling. So students generally should not be submitting supplementary letters of recommendation unless they add very new, unique information to the file. That is certainly not going to be provided by any of the other recommendation letters or many of the other contents in the application, and it would need to be very positive. Because you're making the file, you're making it longer and you're adding more information. So this is true of writing an additional information section in the common application, or just anything that expands the length of the application. You don't want to annoy an admissions officer by adding content that doesn't really marginally add any new compelling information. That could be a problem. There's a saying in admissions, the thicker the file, the thicker the applicants. And what it can also end up doing is it can end up diluting compelling content if you're just throwing extra letters of recommendation and they're not extremely positive or have new information. What that can end up doing is you're just adding more words to the application. And then if you do have impressive, let's say the student did have 2 pretty impressive teacher letters of recommendation. Now they go add 2 supplementary letters of recommendation, or even 1. They read the first 2 teachers and they say exceptional things about the student, and then they go read the supplementary letter, and it's okay. That's not great. It's going to bring down the average or the mean quality of the letters of recommendation. There was somebody in the comments who said, you can add the supplementary letter of recommendation, and it's sort of it's not going to hurt you. It can only help you. That is, I certainly appreciate that person's optimism, and maybe trying to, ease the student's anxieties, but that is definitely not correct. Anything that you submit in the application, as the saying goes, can and will be used against you. So, in the court of college admissions. So do not think that if you submit a subpar recommendation because you want to shoehorn that extra research advisor in there, don't think that in submitting a subpar recommendation, it's not going to hurt your application, because it very likely will if it gets read. So the student does have this, again, a bit of this issue of the relevance trade-off versus the overall quality. I would strongly dissuade the student from, and again, we would vet this, right? So we would actually have the student brainstorm out the anecdotes. What would this research advisor say? What would the debate coach say? Like, we wouldn't just take the student, based off of, at their word, based off of a few lines. Some students think that the teacher or the recommender is going to write something that is exceptionally high quality, and then you ask them to brainstorm all the anecdotes and the experiences, and their opinion was totally miscalibrated and not based on the evidence. And then conversely, they might think the teacher is not going to write them an excellent letter of recommendation, and you actually have them brainstorm different anecdotes, and you give them, we give students like a very significant brainstorming table that has a whole bunch of different qualities that the colleges are looking for, such as intellectual curiosity, collaboration, et cetera, and they basically will come up with various anecdotes for each of those traits. And it could be the case that the student didn't think the teacher was going to write an exceptional letter, but then you have them do the brainstorming table and they have really good anecdotes and specifics. So the student is not always correct. This would be very much subject to brainstorming and further fleshing the details out. But based on the limited information that we have here, the research advisor is the more relevant recommendation versus the debate coach, but the debate is the much higher overall quality. And I would say with any recommendation, you should generally be leaning towards overall quality versus relevance. And ideally, you have both in play. And then it just gets, the analysis becomes more complex once all the variables don't check out, right? So now you start weighing the relevance versus the quality, and to assess the quality, you might need to do the deep dive brainstorming and fleshing out the details to actually really know what the quality is going to be. There could be other weird considerations, such sometimes a student has a research advisor who is maybe not the most proficient in English. That happens sometimes. It would, again, be nice to believe that a college is definitely going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and because they don't speak English as well, but they could just say something very odd, or it's not idiomatically correct, and it comes across, or it's lost. You don't want to risk that. So yes, a college might be understanding, but don't assume that that's going to be the case. It's always better to be safe than sorry and be more conservative. So where this student stands is the supplementary letter. It would depend on the schools that he's applying to. It's possible that in actually fleshing out the details for both letters, none of them adds anything exceptionally novel or anything extremely compelling. I would say, even though the science letter is relevant, it doesn't sound like it's going to be a very compelling one. They only know them for 6 months. It doesn't seem like they interface with them at all. If this is a research advisor, you could sometimes get a PhD student to write the letter, and then the research advisor will simply put their signature, on the letter. That is very often the case in research. A lot of times, a graduate student will actually write the letter, and then the PhD supervisor will sort of put their signature on it, as long as there's nothing that is factually incorrect, because they are so busy. So it is possible for the student, if there's somebody who's lower down, they work with a PhD student, they've never really interacted with the graduate, the advisor, the PI of the lab, they could potentially ask somebody else so that they've come in closer contact with to write it, or they could provide some of the anecdotes, but it's not great that this person doesn't seem to know them very well, and it's a very short stint project. And in terms of the debate coach, it's going to be less relevant versus the science research supplementary recommender. However, if this person basically thinks the world of the students, that would probably be along the lines of, I would say the requirement for submitting this extra piece of information is if this debate coach just thinks this student is absolutely exceptional and has amazing details and anecdotes, then maybe you would consider including it. But again, there's a significant burden of proof, so to speak. It's a supplementary recommendation. It's already adding on top of a lot of other letters of recommendation to teacher recs, potentially a counselor letter of recommendation we have to keep in mind. So you're really thickening the file. You want to make sure that you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, and it's not a relevant recommendation if the student's applying for material science engineering. So I would have to say that the overall quality would have to significantly offset those other issues. Okay, second question. How important is course rigor in freshman and sophomore year? So the student says that they moved a lot during I moved a lot during my freshman and sophomore years, and the process to getting into honors classes was complicated and not an option for me. Is this going to be a deterrent for T20? So they mean top 20 schools. This is very common, actually, in this Reddit forum, is top 20 is very often used in terms of the tier of school. They say, I'm planning to end with 10 APs from junior and senior year, and my stats aren't the worst. That doesn't sound great. But is my easy schedule of freshman and sophomore year going to be red flag? So first of all, I would say if the student's aiming for top 20, and this typically means top 20 national schools, so these are Ivies, Ivy Plus, public Ivies, excellent private schools. It's not great when the student says my stats aren't the worst. So that would be quite concerning, because even though the student does say they're planning on ending with 10 APs in junior and senior year, which is a lot for just those two grades combined to have 10 AP classes. They're averaging 5 APs, in each one of those grades. That course rigor will just be offset anyway if the student doesn't have an excellent GPA, right? And this is something that a lot of people don't quite understand. If you're applying to the top 20 schools, there's sort of this old question as to, do I take an AP class and get a B, or do I take the regular class and get an A? If you're applying to top 20 schools and in the year 2024, or even in any recent years, it is not an either or, it's a both and. It is you both take the hard class and you get an A. It's not, I get a B in an AP, but then my school is going to weight the GPA and the colleges. That's not how it works. At top 20 colleges, it is simply assumed that those students take very rigorous classes, and really essentially what's going to be considered as an unweighted GPA, more or less, because it is just assumed. For instance, at the University of Michigan, there's no weighting that is assigned to the classes because you took 12 APs or whatnot. It is just assumed if you're applying to the University of Michigan, you take a very rigorous course load, and that is the case with essentially all top colleges. So that's concerning a little bit in terms of the students focusing a lot on the rigor, but it doesn't sound like their GPA is necessarily the best, and that is not going to be a strong signal for top 20 schools. You want both to check out both the rigor and the GPA. And you might even be willing to trade off some of the APs, and bring 10 APs down to 8. If you're going to have straight A's and 8 APs versus 3 B's and 10 APs, you take the straight A's in 8 APs. And that's sort of a very delicate seesaw between GPA and course rigor. Now, in terms of answering the student's question, there's kind of some interesting nuances here. One, they didn't take any rigorous classes by their own admission in freshman and sophomore year. Now, that's not always extremely atypical. There are some high schools in the United States that have a lot of honors classes and even sometimes AP classes in freshman and sophomore year. That tends to be the case for very large public schools. there's a lot of different honors. There'll be honors English, there's honors global. They could take, AP biology and freshman year in some cases. It really depends by the school. So the first thing to keep in mind here is the college is going to receive a school profile. They'll know what was afforded to the student in terms of what their high school allowed them to take. Now, I wouldn't get extremely caught up on that if you are coming across other students in the applicant pool who had very high course rigor all 4 years of high school, and you had high rigor in, junior and senior year. Yes, you still have to keep in mind your high school may have limited offerings, and even though admissions officers will often say that they're reviewing you in the context of your high school, and that's true, they are reviewing all of the applicants from that high school together, and they're being read and evaluated together. However, you can go to the admissions committee. If you get to committee and you go past, say, a regional admissions officer, then you are being compared and are competing against other students more broadly across the United States. And certainly all admissions officers, have that broader perspective, even though they often read the applications by the region. They still have a broader, perspective of what other students are taking at other high schools. And so I think there's a bit of complacency that admissions officers give students or families when they say that you're only going to be compared against your high school context. I think that is true to a reasonable extent, but if I get a student and their high school just afforded them way more course rigor than another student's high school, are they going to have an advantage? In all likelihood, yes. Setting aside a bunch of socioeconomic issues or racial issues, if the student came from a high school that is very under-resourced, then that student's going to be given a much more significant benefit of the doubt. But the student will certainly be compared to what was afforded them in terms of their courses. That is, I would say, probably 75 or 80% of the reality. But then you have to sort of keep in mind that if another student just went to a high school that provides way more advanced course offerings, you're not 100% comparing. You can't overlook that as an admissions officer. So that is something that's also important. What was afforded to the student? Did they really not take advantage of substantial course rigor options that were afforded by their high school in 9th and 10th grade? Or did they not have any course rigor in 9th or 10th grade because they weren't even afforded? Those would be two different cases. So that will depend a bit on context. Obviously, you want to do the most that you possibly can because you are in a very competitive landscape competing against the best students in the country. So if your school did afford you these options, then you certainly would have wanted to take advantage of them. Now, the other interesting aspect of this is the student says they're going to be able to take 10 APs without having taken any APs in 9th or 10th grade. And that's not extremely unusual. There are a lot of high schools where you cannot take any APs until junior year. Certainly in freshman year, it's very often the case that you can't take any APs. At a lot of high schools, again, it will depend, but that's not totally anomalous. APs in 9th grade are quite rare. They're a little bit more common in 10th grade at various high schools, but a lot of times the course catalog doesn't really fully open up until you get to 11th or 12th grade. The fact that the student would be taking 10 APs just from junior and senior year, that's certainly very, very high course rigor. Now, some traps the student would need to be mindful of is they now all of a sudden start to go take 5 APs per year. What's that going to do to their GPA? And then in senior year, the problem is a lot of their APs out of these 10 are probably going to be, at least half. It might be something like they're taking 4 in junior year and 6 in senior year. Now you enter all these other issues, such as if the student's applying early to colleges, they're only going to see quarter 1 grades, at most quarter 2 grades in the first semester or the first trimester. For a lot of colleges, they're not going to see the entire year. This is a very common mistake that many students make. The student might be operating out of a deficit, or at least feel they are in terms of course rigor. Now they go add 10 APs on the back 9 of their high school career. And now the student ends up in senior year taking 6 APs, they're applying ED, and now they have to send their quarter 1 grades and they have 3 Bs because they're taking 6 APs, they play fall soccer, they're applying for science research competitions, they're working on their applications. And this is sort of the car accident that I often say to families, like, you don't see coming, because the student ends up in senior year, they might have other commitments. They're working on their college applications. They have their hardest course rigor. They may be applying to research competitions, as I mentioned, and they have other commitments. And then you have this massive convergence, and then you have this very limited runway in terms of your grades, because in the earlier grades, the colleges only see your year-end grades typically. So if you have a bad quarter one, doesn't matter a lot because the colleges are going to see that. If you then maybe don't even you bring it up a little bit more for quarter two, but then by the end of the year, you bring up your final grade, that's typically all that colleges see is the year-end grade, but that's not true for senior year. So this student could end up really significantly overcompensating, loading up something like 6 APs in senior year, and then, against maybe their design, going and not having a very strong quarter one, and now they have 3 Bs because they overlap. So this could get quite tricky. There's a lot of things that are potentially suboptimal. Now, the student's going to go take 6 APs. There are certainly students who can handle 6 APs, and they will still get straight A's. But that is subject to a lot of due diligence as to who are the teachers in those classes, what are their grading policies, there are any real grade deflators at the high school. These are all the nuances that we would typically be taking into account when we're doing course selection, whereas a student might just do what the student's doing, which is sign me up for the maximal number of APs, and then they get a couple of bad grades and they basically have shot themselves in the foot anyway, and there is some sort of optimal balance here. It would depend on if the student is applying for top 20 schools. So let's say we're roughly talking about, an Emory, a USC, a UVA, that's around top 20-ish, top 25-ish schools. That will also dictate how many APs need to be taken. The GPA is not going to change a ton. It's going to be for top 25 schools, and the most selective schools, it's going to be predominantly straight A's, if not entirely straight A's. Typically, it should be straight A's across the board. But in terms of the student being the student who takes 14 APs and, has the highest A average, so A pluses versus maybe A's or A minuses, those are the nuances that are going to be dictated by whether students may be applying to top 25 versus top 15 versus top 10 versus top 5. And we know for those top 5 schools, the Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, MIT tier of schools, the student's going to basically need to max out everything, and many of the students are going even beyond what's afforded at their high school. They're doing very unusual things because that's what it typically takes if you are moving from even top 25 tier to top 5 or top 10 tier. Okay. Next question we have here. How did you come up with your essay topic? So this is a bit of a funny line. Guys, I'm actually screwed. I have no idea what to write for my personal statements. None, in all capitals. I feel like I have had 0 unique experiences, and I'm actively struggling to come up with any life lessons or meaningful thoughts that I would want to share to an admissions officer at all. I've set a personal deadline to have it done by the end of July, but for now, I want to hear how you guys came up with your essay topic. Were there any brainstorming methods you used that were particularly helpful? Please, I'm begging. So, another angsty teenager here who's a rising senior. I appreciate their assiduousness and their diligence. They've set personal deadlines, have the spreadsheets. These are a lot of the kids who are on the Reddit forums, very on top of things. So basically, they're just asking the question of topic, ideation and origination. How do you come up with an essay topic? And they're specifically talking about what they call the personal statement. I have heard more people than I care to remember refer to the Common App personal essay as the personal statement in the last week. Please, if you are listening to this, please call it by the correct name. It is no longer called the personal statement. It is called the personal essay. The Common Application changed the name of the essay a few years ago, and everybody keeps referring to it as the personal statement because I think a lot of college advisors, guidance counselors, people still keep referring to it as the personal statement, even though the name changed several years ago. That bit of pedanticism aside, how do we come up with ideas for the Common App personal essay, which is the main essay, 650 words maximum, that goes to all the colleges and is the main centerpiece essay of many students' applications. So we do have an episode earlier in our series here, maybe it was around number 5 or so, I don't remember the exact number. It's called The Biggest College Essay Mistake. And in that episode, we lay out that many students are applying to, certainly for students who are applying to the top and highly selective colleges, need to be very aware of not writing simply on a personal topic, knowing that a lot of these top and highly selective schools are looking for very, as we refer to them, pointy students or students who have angularity. They have very singular passions that are supported by their profiles, and colleges are looking for very focused students who collectively will create a well-rounded class versus looking for well-rounded students and sort of the jack of all trades. That's not what they're looking for. So in that podcast, we did go through trying not to just write a purely personal essay, but writing an essay that will really tap into your positioning strategy, what your hook is going to be for the application, what is your sort of niche academic contribution going to be for the college, how will you contribute to the, it's not that you're going to write this in the specific essay, you will write this in the school supplements. You're not going to write how you're going to contribute to the school community per se, you'll write those in the school-specific supplements. But it is showing the college what your unique passion is that you've pursued, so implicitly they can connect that to what your contributions would be, but that would be substantiated and specified in the school-specific essays when you're talking about what classes you would take, what you would do, what clubs you would join or found, etc. So the personal essay should be centerpiecing your overall positioning, your overall hook, your unique passion, your first and foremost strength of your application. I would also direct the listener to our first episode if you have not heard it. And that is basically the one thing that every junior must do now. And so I did that podcast back in spring or early summer, sometime around May. And that is basically the auditing of your entire candidacy if you're coming up on the applications or if your student is even in younger grades, and really saying, what are my strengths and what do I have on paper, right? So where's my course rigor the highest? If there's a disparity, where's my GPA? What does my GPA look like in what classes? Not positioning yourself to be a biomedical applicant and another pre-med student if your English and history classes are your strongest. Your grades are stronger, your course rigors stronger in humanities or social sciences, not making that very odd mistake of positioning away from your strengths, auditing your resume, your activities, what is actually very unique versus what are activities that many other students will have, such as sports and basic volunteering and basic community service, and you were a hospital volunteer and you're applying for pre-med, as if there are no other students applying for pre-med who have figured out to volunteer at a hospital. It's not mind-blowing. So it's really auditing, what you think is going to be less common in the applicant pool. What do you have multiple activities? Is there a theme to several of your activities that admissions officer will be able to see and say, oh, there's 3 activities that all speak to this theme, right? So that first episode is really auditing what your hook is going to be. And then we did an episode as well on the personal essay, which is taking that hook and then pulling that together and writing a compelling personal essay, and really not just emphasizing the personal, but having this essay really be more a personalized insight into your academic hook or your passion or that angularity that is going to set you apart in the applicant pool. And going to really show your promise and what unique niche role you're going to play in the college community. And the more niche it is, the better. So being something like behavioral economics is way more interesting than being a business student. Being interested in sustainable finance is way more interesting than finance or even business. And the more niche and unique it is, the better, because it's less likely to overlap with other students in the applicant pool. Once you've identified what that hook is, where your strengths are, your course rigor, your GPA, the classes you've taken, your teacher letters of recommendation, your test scores, what sections were stronger, where your activities point in terms of the themes or the strengths, and you've identified what that all basically equals, as we spell out in the first episode of this podcast, then you want to pull that together, and a lot of times in the personal essay, you are going to be showing either the origin story for that hook, what was the initial inspiration or impetus for that passion, and that unique niche that you're going to occupy based on the theme of your activities, etc., and all the strengths of your candidacy. What was the inspiration for that? If you do science research on a certain topic, what got you extremely interested in that? What paper did you read? What was the origin or sort of the etymology, so to speak, of that? You could also show the reader something in progression, or how you develop the passion or flesh it out. And really speaking to the student's question quite tactically, what the inspiration should be, or what you should very specifically look at to write this essay topic. You should certainly be looking at your candidacy overall and identifying the hook, as we mentioned, because you can't really write this essay effectively without knowing that first. And again, the student's asking tactical questions, whereas a lot of students need to actually back up because they're going to take the wrong tactics because they have not identified what their hook is going to be, or they have the wrong hook. Their hook is not supported. And they're a pre-med student and their activities don't speak to anything pre-med, or they're not very interesting, unique activities. So you do need to back up, audit what the overall positioning is going to be that's going to be unique. Where I would really then look to next is your activities. Your activities in your resume are generally going to be the main building blocks of your admissions hook. And your unique contributions to the future college community. So if you've done science research or some very high-value activity, if you founded an organization, if you founded a club and had exceptional fundraising, if you had some really great initiative with your town, or you did policy research, with your local, with local governments. We've had students who've done all these sorts of things. They worked with sustainability boards in town. They've worked with local small businesses. They've changed policies. They've done statistical research on legislation. They've launched a business. They've launched another organization that does workshops on some topic that's meaningful to them. They founded a club that they're the president of that's related to their interests, et cetera, et cetera. Something that is high value, high impact, and ideally unique and relevant to the narrative. You want to look at those activities, and you want to think about what basically inspired you, or did you personally change along the way on that journey? And again, it could be either the inspiration for, or it could be something along the way. An inspiration would be a student, as I mentioned in the prior podcast on the personal essay, a student whose focus was on studying post-traumatic stress disorder in females specifically, and she had an origin story and an inspiration that came from, in her case, some family trauma. Please do not just start flinging trauma all over the place in these essays. But she did happen to have some trauma, and that was specifically connected to PTSD, as we know that the T in PTSD is, post-traumatic stress. So it makes sense, right? Her topic was in something that related to trauma. She wasn't just mentioning trauma and just sort of flinging it, to make the reader and admissions officers feel bad for her. So that would be more of an inspiration or an origin story for her interest that had a deeply personal connection that inspired her academic hook. It wasn't just trauma or the personal part of the essay. It was a personal motive for her academic interest. And so it's the intersection of the personal, a personalized insight into the academic hook that you're going to be selling the college on. That is an example of an origin story. The other example that I gave was of a student who ran a quite successful business, and she was sort of the avid talker, very extroverted. She had these funny lines about, talking to a waiter in Mexico in Spanish and asking her teacher about their kitchen renovation, just always being, sort of a motor mouth, and how in starting her business, she had to learn to listen to her customers, seek feedback, to iterate through her product to make it even better. And she spoke about doing live streams and all these different having customer surveys and basically switching to a consummate listener. However, if the essay were just about her talking all the time and switching to a good listener, that's more just a personal essay. And I've said this essay's name is really a misnomer. It should not be called just the personal essay. It should be, it should probably be called something more of like a personal statement of purpose, because the statement of purpose gets more to the academic focus or what you're coming to the college to do, which is going to be more primarily academic. She, in the background, was talking about, and the content was about her business. So that was what she was going to study in college, but there was a personalized insight along the way. So that's more of an along the way development or progression with the business in the background. That was her hook. The other student had the inspiration for their hook and studying post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are the two general types that I would have students focus on. First of all, identify, look at your candidacy, look at the evidence. Admissions officers don't care that you've looked up what the highest median salary is for mid-career after you graduate in some major. They don't care about that at all. They are purely evaluating your past and your history as a way of predicting the future. The future is nebulous. And so they're going to be looking at the data and the evidence that's on paper. So make sure you are ideally picking where your strengths are, where your uniqueness lies, and picking the themes that emerge from that candidacy audit. Once you've done that, probably you're going to want to look most at your activities that support these passions and this overall hook, and your academic and extracurricular contributions to the college community, and then find ideally an origin story or an inspiration or an impetus for those activities, or a passion, or show some sort of progression along the way. Okay. Fourth question here. This one should be relatively short, hopefully. So the title is GPA versus cumulative average. I would say that's a false dichotomy. The student actually means something different. GPA is essentially more or less the same thing as a cumulative average. Student says, I have a 2.7 GPA, but an 87 average. What should colleges pay attention to? So what they meant more was the scale. So they meant more, a typical GPA scale tends to be at a 4.0. That can vary by the high school. And then they mean more out of a 0 to 100 scale when they're talking about the 87 average. So in terms of the differences in scale, what would the colleges pay attention to? One of the comments here is whatever is on your transcript. I would say that that's not necessarily correct. So first off, the student, in some cases, the classes will actually be broken down into a 0 out of 0 to 100 grade, and then sometimes there'll be an overall GPA on the overall, like there'll be a cumulative GPA at the top of the transcript. So it actually is quite possible when this person says whatever is on your transcript, it is actually possible at a given high school that they use a 0 to 100 scale for the grades, and then they use a GPA conversion for the cumulative GPA. So they could actually be using both at a certain high school. Second of all, honestly, it doesn't even matter. This is not even a particularly important question because I've mentioned this before, but colleges are not taking your GPA that the high school provides them. They're not going to just take it wholesale. There are so many different GPAs across the United States. As I've mentioned, there are nearly 30,000 high schools in the United States. There are international students applying who might be 10% of the freshman class. Those students will almost inevitably have different grading systems if they are from different countries. If you're from, Australia has 7-point systems for their colleges. It can be extremely disparate, particularly if you're moving between different countries. So it's too unstandardized. There are too many different high schools. There are only a couple of states in the United States that have a standardized GPA system across the entire state. Those are a couple of southern states. But otherwise, the American education system is extremely unstandardized. There are private schools, there are public schools, there are magnet schools, there are charter schools, they're all different types of high schools. They have all different GPA systems. They have 0 out of 100. They have letter grades. They have a 4.0 scale. They have a 4.1. They have a 4.4. They have a 4.4 unweighted. They have a 4.6 weight. It's just, it's a mess. And So admissions officers really need to rely upon their own internal system, and they may have their own way of converting numbers and putting them on a standard scale so that they can more or less compare apples to apples. That has been the traditional argument for standardized testing, hence the term standardized. If you take the SAT, you at least know that the scale is the same. It's 1,600 points for every single student, 36 points for the ACT. And so that's one of the biggest sort of arguments for standardized testing is you have students who go to all these different high schools with different teachers. It's just so unstandardized. There could be rampant grade inflation at one high school. There could be rampant grade deflation at another high school. And so a lot of people use that, in terms of making an argument for standardized testing is that it does provide a level playing field and sort of, apples to apples comparison, at least, in terms of the number that it's out of. So, just keep in mind colleges, one of the things that admissions officers say more than anything is they don't care about the GPA, and they're not going to take it wholesale or at face value. The GPA, as I've also mentioned in prior episodes, it's an average. It doesn't show you the breakdown of the grades. They're going to look at the transcripts. They're going to see, is there a progression to the grades over time? How rigorous were the classes? That often, again, if you're applying to top colleges, is just assume that you took the most rigorous classes, but obviously they're going to look and say, if you're applying for engineering, did you take, more of your rigor? Did you take AP Physics? Did you take AP Calculus? Because that's going to be relevant to that narrative. GPA doesn't tell you anything like that. It doesn't tell you that you're applying for this major and therefore your rigor is more weighted as it should be towards that field. If it's a bit disparate, your course rigor, it doesn't tell you what your your relevant grades would be to that narrative, because those are going to be, if you're applying for, a humanities or a social science field in college, then you would want humanities and social science classes in high school to be the most rigorous and the highest grades. But the GPA doesn't tell you about any of those factors or considerations. It doesn't show you the evolution over time. It doesn't show you the specific class names. It doesn't show you what the actual breakdown is of the grade. So GPA is it does what most figures. So a GPA, an average, is what's known as it's a descriptive statistic. So it is just basically something that captures a much larger amount of data, but in a very concise way. However, in taking a very large amount of data, such as a student's entire transcript with all the nuance that goes with that in terms of the progression of the grades over time, 9th versus 10th versus 11th versus 12th, what the classes were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in collapsing all that data and compressing it down to just one number, you get all the succinctness of a GPA, but you lose all of the richness of the nuance, right? And that's often the case when you have a basic descriptive statistic such as an average. So just keep that in mind. A lot of people will cite their GPA because it's just, again, so compact and so well compressed, and it's easy to communicate. You just say 4.2, 3.8. But it doesn't take into account all these various nuances that admissions officers are looking at. Is that unweighted? Is it weighted? Which, again, is not going to matter because the admissions officer are just going to simply unweight it anyway. They're just going to assume that you have taken a very substantial amount of course rigor in a lot of cases for the top colleges. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time worrying what your GPA is, or are they going to just, take this at face value because this is what's on your transcript. If you're applying to these top and highly selective colleges, you predominantly want to be taking near the maximum or the maximum course rigor afforded by your high school. Again, it will depend on the exact tier. Students that are aiming for the top 5 colleges in the United States is a very different game versus even top 25 schools. And so you see students doing really, really exceptional things, even going beyond, taking extra college courses. It depends on what their high school affords them in terms of rigor, but you get really exceptional rigor once you start crossing the top 5 colleges, and you really need to be towards the max, basically maxed out on the GPA scale if your school has a 100-point unweighted scale and you're applying to Stanford, you need to be pretty close to 100 versus being a 95, which might be okay for maybe a top 25 school, but Stanford's not a top 25 school. It's possibly the hardest school to get into in the United States, if not the world. So, those small distinctions will depend based on, is it top 25, top 20, top 15, top 10, top 5, etc. And it could go from being, a student who's okay with maybe 7 APs for a top 25 to a student who's at, well beyond their high school curriculum, if they're applying to a top 5 school, potentially. And again, depends on the high school and what they afford, how advanced the curriculum is. So there are a lot of nuances there. Generally speaking, if you're applying to top 25 schools, highly selective institutions, you predominantly want straight A's, ideally straight A's, and you want to take the most amount of course rigor that you can essentially pull off straight A's with probably in most cases at maximum 1 B plus or 2 if you're applying to top 25 colleges in the United States. So that is generally how to go about it. A GPA is not going to be something that is just taken wholesale by admissions officers. So I wouldn't worry what that number is. Try to have obviously the highest grades and the highest amount of course rigor that you can pull off in tandem. Okay, 5th and last question. College recommendations, ? Is the subject here. So this is a sort of, I'm going to use this as a more or less a chance me post. So chance me post is basically the student goes through, they give some basics about their candidacy, and they say, where can I get into college? This is a bit of a risky task because no student ever includes enough information to do a fully complex, thorough analysis. So as I mentioned in the last episode, for you to be doing the most, or for somebody to be doing the most accurate and precise assessment of the student's odds at a college, particularly the more competitive it is, the more variables and millimeters that you need to take into account, right? And again, if it's top 25 versus top 20 versus top 15 versus top 10 versus top 5, the differences in students' candidacies get magnified even further and further. Certainly, if you're talking about a top 25 versus a top 50, again, you're really nitpicking a lot more for top 25 schools. If it's top 25 versus top 100, it's night and day difference in terms of the selectivity, as we've mentioned on this podcast. So it will depend on what the tier is, but generally, if we're talking about top and highly selective, mostly top 25 schools, you still need to know a lot of different variables, and many students just give a few variables. They give their test scores, they give their GPA, maybe some sense of course rigor, and then some very broad strokes in terms of what their activities are. And that's 4 variables with not a lot of nuance or context. And so this is inherently a flawed exercise because you don't know a ton of other things about the student. In this case, we actually do know for one of the schools, the student has in-state residency, so that's another variable. We don't know if legacy, we don't know socioeconomic background, we don't know any other special hooks, we don't know what the racial profile is because they don't mention it. And even post-affirmative action, that is going to potentially pop up in a lot of school essays because there are now a lot of affirmative action or post-affirmative action essays that can get at the students' racial diversity or other types of diversity they would bring to the college via those essay prompts now. So there are just so many different variables. What's their high school context? What was afforded to them in the context of their high school? And you can just go on and on and on. They might mention an activity, but, what were their contributions? We don't have that. They may be missing something from their activities list that they're including here that is actually really unique, but they didn't think to include it because it's not as maybe formal of an activity and they miscalibrated. So this is at some level a bit of a flawed exercise, but I'm just going to indulge it because it will give the listener some insight, even if it's not perfect insight. So the student says, I'm a pre-med major, most likely neuroscience, living in Michigan, but so far I only have one school on my list, Wayne State. So the student then proceeds to list their stats. So they have a 3.9 unweighted GPA. We can probably assume it's a 4.0 unweighted scale. However, there are high schools that have something like a 4.1 unweighted scale, a 4.4 unweighted, a 4.3 unweighted, a 4.6 unweighted. So I actually don't 100% know if this is a 4.0 unweighted scale. I would think so because that's quite conventional, but it's certainly, you cannot take that for granted. But going to assume for the purpose of having any analysis here that this is a 3.9 out of 4.0 unweighted GPA. They mention that they have 12 APs and 6 DE. So for those who don't know what that means, DE is dual enrollments. That is where the student dually enrolls, at a community college or other college. DE classes aren't typically considered quite at the rigor of AP classes, but they are considered more or less college-esque classes in terms of rigor. I wouldn't quite, again, put them, on exactly the same footing as an AP class. There may be like an AP light class, more or less. In New York State, there are also, for example, things such as SUPA classes, and there's these other sort of college type of classes. If a student is actually fully enrolled, and they were at a 4-year name brand university taking, a college course, it really depends on the tiers. Is it a community college class? Is it, what school is it, et cetera. So there's a lot of nuances in terms of these sort of, I'll call them college-esque rigor classes. So the student has 12 APs, they have 6 dual enrollment, and they have a 1510 SAT. Now, I'm going to assume this student will have 12 APs and 6 dual enrollment classes because that's a lot. That's 18 more or less college classes. I highly doubt they have 18 classes, 18 college classes for just junior year. I believe they have likely chosen their classes for senior year, and I'm assuming some of those are going to be the dual enrollment classes. And then some, there's going to be a large chunk of the APs that are going to be in senior year as well. So I don't think that that's their junior year. That would also swing the candidacy if the student had something like 18 college classes their junior year. That would be a lot different than if if they were now going to have another 6 in senior year. Now they're up to 24, college classes, right? Or, various honors, accelerated, advanced. And there are very impressive students who get, somewhere up into 25 to 30 honors, advanced, AP, DE, external college classes, certainly for kids that are applying to particularly the very top tier schools. So I do believe the student is referring to the amount of course rigor that would be by the after the end of senior year. And then if they have the 1510 SAT, which is relatively straightforward, thankfully, because it's standardized. So we know what it's out of. It's out of 1600. The student's extracurriculars, varsity tennis for 2 years, varsity swim for 3 years, volunteered at Henry Ford Hospital for 3 years. She puts over 100 hours. VP and then president, senior year for a small nonprofit, founder of the newspaper club at my high school, volunteer at an organization which is a leadership program in Michigan. Again, over 100 hours. She puts STUCO, that means student council class rep, for 3 years. She put, I was considering University of Michigan, but I don't know if I can get into it. Besides that, any other recommendations? Out of state is also okay. Refer colleges with these qualities. Then she goes on to name various qualities in terms of schools. So basically, I'm not going to basically indulge what the question was. The student was looking for colleges that she would be competitive for, particularly along the lines of certain criteria, such as being in the Northeast, being near in a city, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to actually go in that direction. What I'm going to comment is just a little bit in terms of her candidacy, where I would see it standing. I'll mention with respect to the University of Michigan, since she did mention that school specifically. So she's a 3.9 out of, we're going to assume for the purpose of this exercise, 4.0 unweighted GPA. Now, again, the problem with the GPA is we don't know what the distribution, the breakout of the grades actually is. So we don't know, for example, if she had some low outliers. We saw this in one of the other case studies that we performed in one of the earlier episodes. It had a 3.9, but it was a 3.85 that rounded up to a 3.9. They had a 3.3 on the transcript. They had a 3.5 and a 3.6. They were a pre-med student, and some of those lower grades were in STEM classes. This student is also saying that she wants to be a pre-med major, applying for neuroscience. So we just don't know, where was her course rigor? Was it all loaded up in STEM? It's a lot of classes, so it probably would be relatively equal, given that it's so many, advanced classes that she, will have taken by the end of her high school career. But we don't know what classes she specifically took, what subjects they were in, what grade she specifically got, what the progression was. And so, again, admissions officers are going to be looking at the transcript. I would only look at the student's transcript. I never am just looking at a student, they say my GPA is this. I always go into the transcript to actually see what the grade breakdown is and what the classes are. So that is subject to further nuance, but going to assume for the purpose of this exercise that it's a relatively homogeneous 3.9, that there's not any big grade outliers or swings. Going to assume she's roughly equal in terms of course rigor. There's no major differences. She mostly is pretty well-rounded in terms of, the course rigor, and is sort of distributed between, social sciences, humanities, English, STEM classes, because it is a lot of a good chunk of course rigor. And again, I'm going to assume that's through senior year. If it were through junior year, it would be a little bit of a different story. That would be quite substantial at the 18 college classes. And then we don't even know if she had other honors or accelerated classes. So there's 18 through junior year. That's different than if it was going to be 18 through senior year. But I'm going to assume that it's 18 through senior year. I think it's unlikely. It's certainly considerably less likely that it's their junior year. So I'm going to assume it's their senior year, 18 college level classes, and then a 1510 SAT. Her metrics are certainly quite solid with a 3.9 and a 4.0 unweighted GPA. The 18 college classes and a 1510 SAT. It's not that there aren't better students. Certainly at her own high school, there are going to be students with a 4.0 unweighted GPA. I've mentioned previously there's substantial grade inflation in the United States. 50% of students do have, more or less on the borderline between an A- and a B+ average. A very low A, more or less, is half of the United States. A lot of high schools have 50, 60+% students who have very high GPAs. So for all we know, a 3.9, if she goes to a pretty good competitive high school, there are 40 students, 50%, 60% who have that same GPA, even though it looks very good in a vacuum. The course rigor, I imagine, is probably pretty solid in terms of her high school, but again, we don't know contextually. And the 15 SAT, we do know where that stands up. It's not a 1550, it's not a 1570, but it certainly is a quite good SAT score and generally in range for top 25 in schools and what you would want for top 25 schools. So in terms of Michigan, her stats do basically line up from what we know, setting aside a whole bunch of nuances. She seems, in terms of her metrics foundation, like she would be a competitive student for the University of Michigan. In terms of her extracurriculars, another thing that I will say, as far as the University of Michigan, again, this would not be the analysis that we would do if this were an actual student. It would be way deeper. It'd be what's the actual transcript. We would know whether those classes were through junior year or through senior year. We would know what the section breakdown was for the SAT, because if she's going to be pre-med, the math would be a little bit more important than the verbal sections. We would know if that's a super score, if that's a single sitting. We would know if she has legacy. We would know what her, racial or socioeconomic background is. We would have way more information on the extracurriculars and the activities. We would have the 100+ variable analysis, basically. We don't unfortunately have that. But based on what we know, we do have an extra nuance. We do know that she's living in the state of Michigan, so she is an in-state resident for the University of Michigan. Now, that is helpful to her. Michigan is not in a university that is, I would say, the most, sort of parochial or provincial. It's not a school such as UT Austin has a 90% in-state quota, or UNC Chapel Hill that is an 82% in-state quota for North Carolina residents, or even a UVA that has a 2/3. It's not. It's quite friendly and amenable to out-of-state applicants at the University of Michigan, but there still is a residency factor, and so she is not an out-of-state applicant applying to the University of Michigan. That does matter a bit. That does give her a little bit, of a slight advantage here, though there's going to be no shortage of Michigan residents who are applying to the University of Michigan as their top choice and their dream school. And there are many students in the state of Michigan who are the best students in the entire state. And because they have this exceptional flagship, they won't be looking to go out of state or apply to Ivies or taking a much, maybe broader, view. And they will simply just be exceptionally competitive applicants who are choosing to apply to their in-state flagship. So you do have to, be aware of that some of the best students in the entire state of Michigan, which is a quite good state as far as applicants, some of the best are just going to say Michigan is their dream school, and it's going to be their top choice school, and they're not going to apply to maybe a school that some people might think is a bit maybe more of a prestigious institution, such as Penn or Princeton or Harvard or Yale or Stanford, MIT, etc. They're simply going to go to their state flagship. They also have there could be a tuition difference and financial motivation. So certainly the fact that she's an in-state Michigan resident doesn't mean that, she is sailing into the University of Michigan by any stretch. But it is, you would prefer to have it on your side versus not. So we do know that. So that does bode well for her. Her metrics are generally pretty strong, even though we don't know all the nuances. Her resume is not the most compelling. Now, for a very large public Ivy or public flagship such as University of Michigan, the metrics are going to be prioritized a little bit more versus some of the soft factors. Michigan isn't a school such as the UC's, the University of Florida, that doesn't allow for any teacher recommendations. It does actually allow for a lot of recommendations, both teachers and supplementary. So there certainly is a lot of consideration of soft factors, but just like any public Ivy, public flagship, there's going to be a bit more emphasis on the metric foundation than maybe at a very small private, top college as a WashU, an Emory, a Dartmouth, an Ivy League school that's a much smaller institution. There's going to be the holisticity, I guess you could say, or holisticness of the review is going to be much more substantial if it's a much smaller private, a lot of times more liberal arts institution. It will just, they get a lot more into the soft factors versus very large public flagships. Doesn't mean the resume is not important by any stretch, but it's not going to have, those soft factors are not going to have as much emphasis in the application as some of the metrics. There are also many students. It's a very large institution, the University of Michigan. So if you had to build a class of 1,500 students, you could be a lot more picky in terms of the 1,500. If you have to build a class, of, the 5,000 students, because you have 20,000 students overall, there's going to be some regression to the mean, so to speak. So there are some of those institutional factors where the soft factors are not maybe going to be as absolutely magnified as they would be at, for instance, at a school like Dartmouth. Very, very small, liberal arts heavy Ivy League institution. There are so many applicants that are applying to these large public flagships. That kind of cuts down on some of the review time or how deep they go into some of the other soft factors. All that being said, it doesn't take too much away from the necessity of students to still differentiate themselves at a college like the University of Michigan from all of the other students. There are going to be many, many, many students who have 3.9 unweighted GPAs. They take very rigorous course loads, and they have very top test scores, both in-state at the University of Michigan, and then also out of state at the University of Michigan. Given that it's just a predominant national research university with a major brand name, and you're also going to get a ton of cross applicants from the top Ivies. Michigan is one of the public flagships that is not blocked out by a lot of the single choice early action plans at schools such as Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale. And so you're going to get a lot of cross applicants from even the students who are applying to some of those top 5 schools, who are going to be stealing certainly a lot of spots at the University of Michigan. So it doesn't take a lot off of the soft factors, but her extracurriculars, she has varsity tennis for 2 years. She has varsity swim for 3 years. Those are going to be very common in terms of sports for all students applying to college. Unfortunately, those are not going to be differentiators. The athletics, because so many students play a sport. Volunteer at a hospital, again, with the pre-med positioning, it's just not a very unique activity, unfortunately. Over 3 years, it's 100 hours, which is okay. But if you're talking about 150 weeks, it's less than an hour per week, roughly. It's not a major commitment. It is nice that she's done it for 3 years, but unfortunately, hospital volunteership is not a extremely unique activity, and it's very, very common for students who are taking the, again, very common pre-med angle, as we've seen in previous episodes. If you're going to take a very non-unique positioning strategy, such as pre-med, you have a lot more burden on your candidacy to differentiate because it is just so common in the applicant pool. She is the vice president and then the president in senior year for a small nonprofit. Now, this really is a nuance that matters a lot. What is the theme of the nonprofit? If this is a nonprofit that's related to something that is actually medical or neuroscience, then it would be a relevant activity, and she would have leadership in an activity that's relevant. If it is not relevant to the positioning strategy or to the narrative, she has leadership, but it's not relevant leadership. And we saw a couple of episodes as I went through a student who was also a pre-med applicant who did not get into 2 top 25, top 35 institutions with excellent metrics similar to hers. That student had a lot of leadership, but it wasn't relevant leadership. It didn't all speak to a similar theme. He only had a couple of activities that really spoke to a biomedical narrative, and they weren't even particularly that impressive. One was being a volunteer for a breast cancer charity, which again is just not going to be a major differentiator for students who are positioning for pre-med. There are too many of them, and they all have activities that look very similar to that. And then he had sort of a science research mentee position that was conveyed in a very low value way and didn't spotlight any unique contributions. There was no publication that came from it. There was just nothing, no high value contributions that came from the research project as he conveyed them in the application. So the student again is coming with a very common positioning strategy as a pre-med major. I would not take that for granted by any stretch, that the student is just going to position herself as pre-med and as an MD. There is no reason whatsoever for her to position herself that way. She could easily be positioned in another way. There's no connection per se with neuroscience and being pre-med. So you could be a neuroscience, you can go out to do neuroscience PhD. You can, and be going more down research track, which is still going to be more unique compared to telling the college you want to be an MD. There are other things that you could do with neuroscience. You could do marketing. There's neuroscience and business. There are neuroscience studies they've done on wine and pricing and how to price expectations, change how you experience the wine. She could do a whole bunch of things with neuroscience or find other interesting career connections. So there is no necessary connection between being a neuroscience major and doing pre-med or going to medical school and being a doctor. And neuroscience is not neurology, which is also a very important distinction. So in terms of what the student applies for in terms of majors, if she wants to optimize her college admissions chances and go to the best institution that she possibly can, she really should be thinking a bit beyond just positioning herself as a doctor. There's no necessity. You're going to the Arts and Sciences College regardless, as I've mentioned many times on this podcast. You could be a philosophy major, you could be a biology major, but you're just going to be yet another biology major pre-med. And so there is absolutely no necessity and there's no upside of her positioning herself as being a doctor. She's not going to any different special college at the University of Michigan. It's not as if she's going to the medical school at 17 or 18 at the University of Michigan. She's just going into LSA and the main Arts and Sciences College, and she can study whatever she wants. She can major in whatever she wants. Her application is not necessarily obligating her to any of, she could change these in the same college. So she really should be choosing the best strategy and the best positioning that makes use of what she has in her candidacy. And certainly if she is going to senior year at this point, she really needs to make the most out of what she has on paper. So I would question a lot of the pre-med positioning. Unfortunately, her medically relevant activities are not the most impressive. She then is the founder of a newspaper. It's nothing to do with the overall pre-med narrative or neuroscience. It's good. It's a leadership. It shows initiative that she was a founder, but it's not relevant. Volunteer at another leadership program, but it doesn't seem like it's medically relevant. And then student council class rep. So she has sports, then she has leadership that's not particularly relevant leadership, and then where she has sort of biomedically leaning activities, it's only one of them. We don't know what the nonprofit is, but the only one is the volunteer at the hospital, and unfortunately that activity is a dime a dozen for pre-med applicants. So she does not have an excellent, what we refer to as positioning strategy. It's not a very unique positioning strategy. There are two paths to go. One is just assuming that she is going to do something like neuroscience. If that's going to be the case, she's in halfway through July going into senior year. She needs to go get herself a research position in neuroscience, psychology, neurology, and start sending a whole bunch of email reach outs to go get herself a science research position and get a more compelling, relevant activity. If she wants to go down this neuroscience path, I think that's a question mark. But if she wanted to go the neuroscience path, you would hope that her volunteership at the hospital is more in the neurology division or something more neuroscience relevant. Hopefully she has some contributions in that volunteership, not that she's just walking around and doing menial tasks, but that is often the case for volunteers. So hopefully she has some compelling bullets there. Hopefully the nonprofit is medically leaning if she wants to take that tact and the neuroscience angle. If she's the founder of the newspaper club, she probably wants to start writing some columns about neuroscience and start coming up with an interesting intersection there between the writing and the STEM, which would be interesting. She might want to start launching some mental health initiatives or some neuroscience initiatives through her leadership positions, such as the student council class rep. The sports, unfortunately, are not going to have any relevance. She could go do what we have had a student in the past several years ago do, which is to write a newsletter. So she seems to be a writer and founder of the newspaper club. We had a student several years ago who wrote a newsletter for a children's hospital that explained to the children in plain children speak what their diseases meant and what their illnesses were. That's really excellent. It's very unique. It's very likable. It takes some of her writing background and some of her writing talent that she might have and then intersects it with some of the science themes. So that would be excellent. If she then has a club at her high school that is somewhat relevant to the neuroscience theme, or she could found one in time before she applies to college, that would be another thing that she could do. So you have several things: getting a science research position over the summer, sending email reach outs, adding more depth to maybe her hospital volunteer position, or maybe scaling it back if she can't add enough contributions to make it higher value. She could use some of her leadership at the school to start launching some potentially biomedically relevant or mental health relevant or psychology or neuroscience relevant initiatives. She, as I said, could launch a newsletter. She could start writing about neuroscience and intersect that with her writing background. She could join another relevant club or found one at her school. And the list goes on and on and on. She could keep adding more things. Obviously, it's getting very late because a student at this point is really writing their essays and starting to write their essays. And so it gets very difficult if she's basically applying right now because she's writing her essays while she's still trying to put in place the building blocks of the narrative. But it can be done, and unfortunately, a student might have to write some of their essays. They either have to wait to write some of their essays as they're waiting for some of their resume to come through, or even more practically, some of this content may not make it into the essays, but it will go in the activities list, the additional information section, etc. And potentially even a supplementary letter of recommendation if she got a research position. Now, the other thing that I would potentially question is whether she should position herself for neuroscience. Is that too competitive of an angle to take? There's no necessity, again, to her conveying herself as a pre-med major. So it would totally dissociate the two of wanting to declare oneself as a future physician or pre-med. Absolutely no necessity. I would totally suggest she keep that out of the application. It's not as though she built a resume where that is so above and beyond obvious. She only has one hospital volunteership, and there's a bunch of other things that have nothing really on their surface to do with anything biomedical. It's not as though they're going to look at her resume and say, oh my goodness, she has 8 biomedical activities. Of course, she's going to be a pre-med major. And this is quite common. A lot of students have under-impressive resumes for very competitive angles that are particularly pre-professional, and the 5 to 6 career paths that are just so common: pre-med, pre-law, engineering, business, just computer science, the same stuff over and over and over and over again that many kids apply for. And again, that just increases how impressive your resume needs to be if you're going to apply under a very common angle. It sets a much higher bar for your candidacy. If you're going to be a linguistics major, nobody's going to be wondering or questioning your motives as a linguistics major in terms of how passionate you are about linguistics. It's not a prestige field. It's not something that any student would have a societal default bias towards, such as medicine. It's not a glamour major. Very different from medicine. There are a lot of students who are just falling into sort of a societal default bias. They're thinking about prestige careers, and that doesn't land the best for college admissions because it just ends up creating a lot of students who apply for the same things without having really the candidacy to really, really, really substantiate or differentiate them under that very common positioning angle. So taking a more lateral approach here, the linear approach would be we just assume that she is hitting the right tunnel here, and she just builds out tactically the neuroscience angle and some of the ways that I've mentioned, either direct or intersecting it with another field that she has in her resume. The lateral thinking, which would be maybe she's just on the wrong path altogether, and she's not going to be able to build a compelling enough neuroscience, and certainly not pre-med, but again, I'm dissociating that from the neuroscience in time, especially given how late she is. In that case, maybe she should go a different route. And if she has some of these writing strengths, or we pull out some other really prevalent themes through a deep dive analysis of her resume that become a lot more prominent, maybe the writing, actually, there's another 2 activities that she didn't include in this activities list, and actually her best angle is to go something that speaks to that interest because it's the most well-supported and one that she has the most evidence for, then that's fine. Then she applies for that major, and then she goes to the college and she switches it, and then she can go do pre-med and do whatever she wants. But it is important that there is some understanding as to the positioning is flexible, and if you want to optimize your odds of admission, you need to make the positioning optimized as well. Now, there's no shortage of things that she could do to further build in a linear way the neuroscience narrative and still have some other interesting, maybe interdisciplinary connections. But the neuroscience is going to be a little bit more of a competitive field, even if it's not specifically pre-med. And so there are still some liabilities. So there's a lot of different ways you could think about this. One is just thinking linear and having her really tactically go build the neuroscience angle. Another one is we actually strategically position around this like a different major that's maybe more well supported by the evidence that she has in her resume. And a lot of times students actually do have a lot of unique and interesting facets, and they just they actually don't put them in their extracurricular list. She's only putting 5 or 6 extracurriculars, but a lot of times students have a very fascinating other extracurricular that they didn't mention. They maybe have an activity that on its surface, maybe doesn't look like something, such as writing, but they were doing writing for the activity. So the way that we would devise the strategic positioning here is actually by doing a much deeper dive analysis and really fleshing out a full-blown resume and then all the bullets and the contributions and a full discovery. Because a lot of times students simply miss stuff that is actually much more compelling. And unfortunately, varsity tennis and varsity swim and some of these activities just are very, very common activities. So we would be looking for things that actually would be differentiators. All that being said, she would have a good deal of work in terms of making her resume more impressive. I would say even for the University of Michigan, understanding that the metrics are going to be emphasized a little bit more versus a little bit more versus maybe a very small private top college. Even so, she still needs a resume that is going to be more competitive, I would say, for Michigan to differentiate herself, to differentiate her applications, because a lot of these essays are going to have very unique topics that speak to that theme and that hook, and that is coming disproportionately from her resume. So hopefully that was helpful to everyone as we went through these 5 different questions on Reddit that the students had, and we will leave it off there for this episode, and we will see you guys in the next episode. Bye-bye.